Bastogne is an indelible part of the heritage of the 101st Airborne Division, and it's writ large as part of the Battle of the Bulge and the heroic stand of the units that were there that blunted the German attack in the Ardennes and essentially turned the war in the West into what would ultimately be the complete destruction of the German army. However, it's much more than that, and it applies to the division today. And that is the individual grit and determination of the soldiers and their tough psychological makeup. And the other is the superb leadership that was rendered by the junior officers and particularly the NCOs at the squad, platoon, and company level. Those two things in combination made the difference. We read of General McAuliffe and the senior officers, but they were really just orchestrating the structure and the force that they had. And that force was superb. And it was made up, as I said, with the tough-mindedness of the soldiers themselves. Now, I've been blessed through my own personal history with being able to talk to a great many of the veterans of the 101st and to actually have walked the ground with some of them, to include Dick Winters and his band of brothers, but also innumerable other vets that were part of the program. And when I was in the Army wearing the uniform, they would take the time to talk to me about it because it was basically just soldiers. We'd sit around and drink beer and talk about things and events of our own livelihood and what we'd experienced. And talk with the 101st invariably got to Bastogne and the Bulge. It was a searing experience for all of them, but more than anything, in my mind, it depicted why the division was so good and why it was so effective under incredibly poor conditions. And this is what I'd like to relate to you because I think it has application today. The mind of the soldier and the quality of the junior leadership is absolutely essential, regardless of where you're at, whether it's in Bastogne or the Ukraine or someplace TBD. You've got to have those two factors to be successful. And the question is, are you doing the training? Are you doing the work necessary to achieve the same level of capability that those soldiers had in 1944? Let me walk you back and take you through the history as it was related to me by these personnel. First of all, they had been taken out of Market Garden, the invasion in Holland, in the November period. They were seriously beat up. Many of the units were at less than 50% strength. They were exhausted physically and mentally. They moved into a number of French casernes in order to recover themselves, and they were placed in the SHAEF headquarters strategic reserve, the 82nd and the 101st, neither of which were expected to be deployed during the winter period. As a result, when they rolled up in the trucks in early December, they were met by a very efficient supply and services organization that immediately took from them all of their broken weapons and equipment, their old clothing, their shoes that needed to be repaired. Their ammunition was turned in. They went into a series of hot showers, medical examinations, and fresh fatigues, and were sent into the barracks with basically nothing but literally the fatigues on their back. They were given a very liberal leave policy. Half of the unit was off to Paris and other locations for week passes and weekend passes. There was a series of athletic teams set up within the remaining personnel. They had movies every night, really good food, and basically they were just completely bagged out and recovering, something they needed desperately. They had received no replacements while they were in Holland. As a result, in the French barracks, they began to receive replacements and integrate them within the units. Well, then the Germans decided that they were going to have a voice in the party. And on the 16th of December, they began what was now known as the Battle of the Bulge. By the morning of the 17th, it was clear to General Eisenhower and his personnel that this was a serious, major incursion, and he needed all the help that he can get. The units that were thinly spread across the front lines of the Ardennes were being pushed back, penetrated, and basically defeated in detail. Two entire regiments of the 106th Division were surrendered. At the 29th Division was decimated. The 4th Cav was scattered in small parts. 8th Corps, which was headquartered at Bastogne, had a very shaky idea of what actually was in existence. General Middleton, the Corps commander, could see streams of his soldiers coming back, shattered personnel. Into this, General Eisenhower rushed the 82nd and the 101st as the only viable reinforcement forces that he had. And at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 17th, the NCOs came running through the barracks, said, get up, pack your stuff. We're moving out at first light. Well, this is a great shock to the troops who were basically bagged out. They had very little on hand, and all the soldiers talked about the confusion. Where are we going, Sarge? I don't have a rifle, Sarge. Where's the clothing? I need ammo. None of this was organized for these guys to actually go off to war. But go off to war they did. They grabbed everything they could. They basically five-finger discounts, blankets, and weapons, and anything else they could scrounge from the local support troops that were in the area. And they grabbed all of the sheets and pillowcases and anything else that looked white to take with them. Basically, they just stripped the place. Trucks were sent out to Paris and other R&R areas to grab what soldiers and officers that they could find and bring them back as fast as possible. By noon on the 17th, the trucks were rolling toward Bastogne and the Belgian border. Now, these were not your standard passenger trucks. These were whatever trucks the services of supply could find and grab and bring in the quantity necessary to move the 82nd and the 101st. And they did a superb job of bringing trucks. The problem was, as all the vets said, the trucks were uncovered and there weren't a lot of them. So what would happen is they would press up to 30 troops in the back of a open deuce and a half or a flatbed truck. And that's what they rode in for over 24 hours in basically rain, sleet, and snow, and much of it in the darkness. The soldiers were absolutely shivering, and they weren't stopping for any rest breaks. The term pissing in the wind took on a whole new connotation. As the troops got closer to Belgium, they began to see the remnants of the retreating American army. And these guys were downcast, 29th Division guys, other elements, mixed and matched, artillery, cars, tanks, infantry marching. And remember now, the troops that got on these trucks didn't have much in the way of clothing, very little in the way of food, and very little in the way of weapons and ammunition. Most of the crew serve weapons had been turned into ordnance, and many of the individual weapons also. They were able to scrounge what they could in the area, so everybody generally had a weapon of some sort, but not the TOE. And most of the units on the trucks, as I said, were half to maybe 3/4 in strength. But the troops didn't bother them that much because they just went into their normal mode, if you would, mentally, to go to war. And as vehicles would stop going in one direction to allow the other direction, the retreaters, to pass. The troops would go over and they would barter for equipment, or the soldiers that were retreating would just give them their weapons. One vet told me that as he was kind of slowly moving along, he spotted up ahead a soldier from the 29th with his machine gun on his shoulder. And as the truck came by, he reached over and grabbed the weapon and brought it back into the truck. And he said the other soldier just looked at him and waved. That's how he got his machine gun. The closer they got, the less interested the retreating soldiers were with what they had. So they happily threw ammo and K rations and anything else that they might have loose that they were willing to give up on board the trucks. The trucks arrived at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, between noon and 4. The first one arrived, the advance party, around noon on the 18th. And at that point, they were met by the advance party of the 101st, primarily Lieutenant Colonel Kennard, who was the G3. And what he did is he grabbed the lead element, which was the 5-0 deuce, and said, we really don't know where the Germans are, but we want you to move out to the villes up ahead and hold the roads. And that became the defense for Bastogne, holding the villages that intersected the roads. And into this, the individual soldiers got off their buses and their trucks, no buses, trucks, and moved directly down the road to the LOCs. And they manned those villages and the woods to the left and the right. Now, this is where the point of the individual soldier comes in. The weather was absolutely freezing all the way to Bastogne. So they arrived, they were basically completely frozen. Every soldier that I talked to mentioned how cold he was on this vehicle, riding through the wind and the sleet and the rain with minimal to no protection whatsoever, only their body warmth jammed in together. They were then sent off into small unit locations to defend on the left and right of these LOCs. And because of their lack of strength and their lack of complete TOE weaponry, they were over a very wide and dispersed distance. A company which normally might occupy an area of about 100 yards was now occupying over 500. Individual soldier positions were usually about 20 meters apart, and with attrition, it worked up to about 40. Well, this became a great challenge to the junior leadership that I had mentioned. So they would dig in their troops as best they could figure out where to displace them. No organizational unit cohesion as such. You couldn't see the units to the left and right. They were separated by these deep snow fields, the heavy fir woods. So every unit was somewhat isolated. That has an effect mentally, as the troop said. I couldn't see the platoon next to me, left or right, but I didn't worry about that because I was in my platoon and I could see us. And that's really all that mattered. The soldier psychology was absolutely essential to their success. They didn't mind being surrounded. The guy said, hey, we're airborne. We're supposed to be surrounded. So it wasn't a factor. They weren't able to gain much from the retreating units. They had already left. They're no sooner thrown into the line than the Germans start probing. And the Germans had some handicaps. They had to come down the roads and they had to go through the snow. Same issues that the airborne had to do. Well, the difference is it's always easier to defend than to attack. Part of the program of what was inside Bastogne were elements of the 9th and 10th Armored Division. There were 2 tank destroyer battalions. Tank destroyer was a 75 or a 90 millimeter gun on an open turret on a Sherman tank chassis. And these things were farmed out to each unit as necessary in a fire brigade sort of situation. The Germans never conducted a fully coordinated attack in all 360 degrees. Instead, they would probe here, probe there, and as they were doing this, the leadership was able to send in little penny packets of tanks and tank destroyers and some additional infantry, perhaps, to a particular threatened sector. But the sector itself was held, usually by a platoon in one of these little villages astride the road, and maybe a platoon to the left and a platoon to the right flanks to hold it. As the Germans came down with their armor, artillery, and infantry, they would be met initially by these troops and then reinforced by whatever capability General McAuliffe was able to send out to that particular threatened sector. I should mention at this time that a tremendous issue was associated with the cold and the inability of the troops to actually stay warm and fight at the same time. As a result, the junior leadership had 2 points that they usually always pursued, and the vets mentioned this across all of the numbered elements, so I know it was kind of consistent throughout the division. Number one is they had constant patrolling. They had so many gaps between the units that the leadership would send out 2-man patrols or maybe a squad at most to fill these voids, to overwatch them, and to keep some coherent capability of observation and control of all of the avenues of approach that led into Bastogne. And they would occasionally have firefights. They would have a German patrol doing the same thing, trying to find a weakness in the lines. And these units would conflict with each other. They'd have an action. They'd bring in whatever assistance they could get, and then they'd restabilize the line. And this is at this point that the vets mentioned to me the other thing that bothered them more than the cold was the German artillery. For the first time, the Germans massed artillery and used it very consistently and with a great deal of ammunition, something they had never experienced before or done. Habitually, in the past, the Germans might have 4 or 5 guns. They'd shoot 2 or 3 rounds apiece, and that would be it. Now they were shooting as much as the U.S. units were used to shooting, battery 5. And they were primarily tree bursts. And these were tall fir trees, maybe 50 feet high. And those rounds would land in the top of the trees and shatter the trees and flake down into the ground. Any exposed soldier was dead meat. You'll see if you go back to Bastogne, you'll see a lot of holes in the ground. What those holes are missing is the overhead cover. The other thing you'll see is a lot of holes together, such as the E Company locations at Foy. But don't let that fool you. In talking to Winters and his guys, he said, hey, those holes were all dug by different groups of troops transiting through and holding the ground for that time. No soldier stayed in the same hole for more than a day or two. He was patrolled out or he was moved to a different position. And this did 2 things. The patrolling kept them moving, and that was a good thing because it added warmth. And the patrolling and the digging also provided additional coverage for the defense. And instead of having just one hole here, you dug in and stayed. You stayed there for a while, and then you got moved over by the squad leader, 50 yards off to the right to dig another hole. That kept you warm also. All the positions were basically 2-man foxholes with overhead cover. Staying warm was the crucial issue and the one that was most difficult. Troops would go into town and they would grab straw, hay, bring it back to their positions, and they would twist it very tightly in little twine cigar size bundles, put it in the bottom of the hole and light it. Well, if you inverted one of those little straw twists and lit it on the top, it might burn for maybe 5 minutes, and you and your buddy were hanging over it, getting whatever warmth you can. Winter said that up to that point, they had a no fires and no light law in all of their defensive positions. They overlooked that at Bastogne because they realized that that was the only warmth people were getting. The artillery was also causing major problems for the soldiers themselves in terms of medical support. The medics were having a very difficult time. Within Bastogne, they had lost the primary division hospital and most of the doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. So as a result, the hospital that was created in the center of Bastogne was very lightly manned, didn't have many doctors, didn't have many of the military nurses, but it had what it had, and it was augmented by nuns and some of the female civilians in Bastogne that had been working at the hospital and had nursing experience. But what that meant was that only the most seriously wounded could be evacuated back to Bastogne proper. The medics did triage under artillery, and I talked to a medic, and he said, "Hey, you know, if you had frostbite but no gangrene, you're staying in your hole. If you had trench foot and no gangrene, you were staying in your hole. If you had a relatively mild wound that did not incapacitate you to the point you could not defend yourself, you were staying in that hole. They'd put you in the hole, you were exempt from patrolling perhaps, but you had to defend that position. And you defended that position statically, which was not a good deal because of the temperature." All of this goes back to the mentality of the soldier. They felt, and I talked to each of these vets, and they were uniform, independently uniform of their opinion that, hey, we can do it. We were mad at the Germans. We were going to kill Germans. We could deal with the cold to a degree. We had ourselves at as best a situation as we could get. We didn't have much in the way of food. We didn't have much in the way of mutual support, but by God, we were there and we were going to do the job, and they did it. They saw very little of the officers above company level, and for a good reason. At the battalion and regimental level, their entire time was spent in figuring out where their positions were, where the Germans were, and how to manage these incoming attacks. There were incessant attacks all the way around the perimeter, all 360. And each of these had to be dealt with because the lines were so thin that the only way the division could stand alone was to be able to push in reinforcements in a hurry, bring in what limited artillery they had, and they didn't have much in the way of shells initially, and just try to stuff each incursion as it occurred. So at the pointy end of the spear, you had the small units, the squads and the platoons, holding the key LOCs, and then you would bring in behind them whatever reinforcing capabilities the regiment have, or even got really bad, the division might bring in. All of which makes the point, again, that what really made the division as a division was the squads and the individuals. The question you have to ask today is this applicable? Well, yes. If you look at what's going on in the Ukraine, it's essentially small deployed units with great mental toughness that are achieving a capability far greater than the actual forces on paper might indicate. If you look at the war itself and you see that it's basically a war of fires, what does that mean? That means if you're a massed organization, you're probably not going to last very long. So what you have is a whole series of small but lethal units with communication capability and soldiers that are very disciplined and very militarily, psychologically hard. So that was what you see today in the Ukraine. That's also what you saw yesterday in Bastogne. And the issues for you to address are simply, are you doing the training today that's going to prepare you for a war tomorrow? And do you have the mental toughness, discipline, and organization to ensure that your individual soldiers have that necessary mental toughness when they go into battle against very difficult odds? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, do you have the focus on leadership at the small unit level that is going to allow your squad leaders, platoon sergeants, platoon leaders, and company commanders to achieve success on the battlefield? That is the issue that you have to address. Thank you.